The topic, though, is the three modes and psychology, isn't it?
Spiritual psychology.
What's that?
Spiritual psychology.
Not the three modes.
Which could be
It all ties in. Everything is ultimately connected. So, anyway, psychology, you all know this. This is real simple, but I'll just put it up here. This Greek word psyche, as they pronounce it more or less, which means the mind or the spirit, and the logos, of course, which means something like the logic. You know, rough translation, logos means different things in Greek, but something like, well, it's like in the New Testament, in the book of John, in the beginning was the logos, the word. But, so the logic, roughly speaking, the logic of the mind or the spirit, some systematic, reasonable investigation into or explanation of the mind, our conscious life, our mental life. So, and of course, psychology, that's the English word. Anyway, if you look at psychology, psychology is not as some fresh in it, something like the philosophy of the mind, some inquiry into the, into the wisdom of understanding consciousness and so on, especially in the 60s. I mean, there are types of psychology that in the past or even now are concerned with things like that, but the way psychology really functions in our society, if you look at it, almost if you talk about the sociology of psychology, in the sense of how does the field, how does the discipline, how does the department of psychology, how does it function within our society, the sociology of psychology. And for the most part, it has to do with trying to make people better. In some way of taking a person, a conscious person, and trying to improve them in some way so they have less anxiety or a more meaningful life, or they're less crazy or more functional or something. But it has something to do with correcting, fixing, healing, improving, and so on. And so what I want to say here is that all these words or concepts, fixing, healing, correcting, improving, adjusting, and so on, they all assume certain facts about the nature of reality, or they assume that certain things are true about the nature of reality, or about the nature of consciousness. And what these things all assume to be true is that we can even talk meaningfully or intelligibly about a normal or healthy state of mind and an abnormal or unhealthy state of mind. Clearly, in a totally relativistic worldview, in which there are no fixed reference points, everything is relative to everything else, we really could not speak meaningfully about healthy consciousness and unhealthy consciousness. We can only talk about states of mind that some people like or don't like. And so, I mean, the first interesting point to raise is that is psychology, is it almost like the mental version of cosmetic surgery, like I look like this, but I want to look like that? I come from Southern California, where a significant portion of the phone book is the list of, the yellow page, a list of cosmetic surgeons, especially in the area I live in. Of course, the other major part of the yellow page is lawyers. But anyways, if you consider, say, cosmetic surgery, is it meaningful to say that, well, the way your nose looks right now, you don't really want your nose to look like that. You really want your nose to look like that, this other thing. Is that really objective, or is beauty in the eye of the beholder? Are there really absolute standards of beauty, let's say, in the way faces look? And you could raise the same kind of issue about the mind. Let's say, for example, someone is schizophrenic, or what they used to call split personality. What about a society which values that feels that some of the split personality is like channeling the gods, or simply has a richer life because they can be more than one person? Why be only one person when you can be two? It's like, why have only car if you can have two cars. And so, the same is true of psychology as any other field, and that is, if you look at it closely, the same sort of universal philosophical issues arise. And that is, can we meaningfully really talk about objective states of mental health and mental illness? Or what we really mean, okay, I put that in English grammar. Do we really mean to say that certain states of mind are just unpleasant for us? Like, for example, if someone is chronically depressed or has phobias, sort of irrational fears. Of course, some people think that the fear of God's wrath is a phobia, an irrational fear. So there are cases. So are there really just pleasant and unpleasant states of mind, or can we really talk about health? Is that all what health means? Like, if you feel good, are you healthy? If you just feel good. What about a serial killer that has tremendous self-esteem? So if the definition of psychological health simply is reduced to feeling good or feeling good about yourself, having a good level of self-esteem, what about a serial killer that feels good about himself? It's a gender bias, right? Because there was one female serial killer in Florida, so anyway. But they're mostly men. So what about a serial killer that feels good about himself? Is that person psychologically healthy? I think the example of a serial killer with high self-esteem, Hitler probably had high self-esteem. This points out that a hedonistic definition is insufficient. By hedonism, here I don't just mean like pigging out, but I mean just hedon, this Greek word which means pleasure. It sort of means just the philosophy that if it feels good, it is good. Even if your pleasures are very refined and virtuous, still it's the idea, hedonism basically is the idea that the ultimate arbiter, the ultimate judge of the value of things is whether or not they provide pleasurable sensations. Anyway, to make a long story short, or to make a short story long, the point I'm driving at here is, I'm not going to go into this at length philosophically because I think you may all agree with me without doing that. It would be, I think, reckless and ultimately unacceptable to most of us to reduce morality to sensation. In other words, to say that if something feels good, it is good. Or if something feels bad, it's bad. Which would lead us to all kinds of terrible conclusions, like that killing someone, if you enjoy doing it, is a good thing, and taking medicine, even if it saves your life, is a bad thing if it gives you, if it is unpleasant. So clearly, it gets into all kinds of interesting philosophical things. Like, for example, it gets into the philosophical. I'll eventually get to my spiritual duties here and talk about Krishna. Otherwise, I'll probably get fired and not be invited back here. But I kind of want to put this in a philosophical context, so that, for example, what was I about to say? Yes, there's sort of a popular notion, which is, I think, ultimately irrational. But it's sort of out there in our society nowadays, that if someone feels happy, then they are happy. That's what happiness is. If someone says to me, I'm happy, then they are happy. And that no one else has the right to tell someone they're not happy if the person reports to us that, yes, I am happy. Anyone here seen that Monty Python movie, The Holy Grail? About to sort of perform that euthanasia on that old guy. He says, no, I'm happy. Anyway. So, of course, people use that argument that if I feel that something makes me happy, then it does make me happy, if that's what I believe. But then you're led to, I think, a troubling conclusion. That, let's say one person says it makes me happy to murder innocent people in the most painful way possible, and I always make sure they die slowly. And someone else says, well, my pleasure, what makes me happy, is to help people. I'm inspired by Mother Teresa or whatever. And so my pleasure, my happiness comes from loving people and helping them. Now, are we really prepared to say that both these people are experiencing the same emotion? That if someone, in contrast, that bumper sticker performs, let's say, random acts of cruelty and senseless acts of mayhem. I mean, let's say someone actually derives what, I don't want to say perverse pleasure because that kind of tilts the discussion. So let's just keep it neutral. Let's say someone derives pleasure from causing as much pain to innocent people as possible. And someone else derives pleasure by helping people as much as possible. Are we prepared to say that those people are experiencing exactly the same consciousness and the same emotion? I don't think we are. Does anyone here want to argue that they are exactly in the same state of consciousness? And if both of them report to us, I feel great. I just murdered, 39 school children. And another person says, I feel great. I just fed 39 school children that didn't have enough to eat. That both of them are in the same state of consciousness, experiencing the identical emotion. Does anyone want to argue that? Well, if you don't want to argue that, then what you're faced with is a linguistic problem. We are actually faced with a linguistic problem. And that is that in our English language and in our modern culture, we would use the same word for both those things. In other words, the monster would say, I'm happy because I just killed 39 school children. And the humanitarian would say, I'm happy because I just fed 39 hungry school children. And yet, if we say that happiness is subjective, we are forced to conclude that they both are in the same state of mind, experiencing the same emotion. And so there seems to be some, if we can do a little, very quick here, ad hoc, cultural, linguistic anthropology. What we're forced to acknowledge is that there's a problem in the language. And say there's a problem in the language often means there's a problem in the culture. Because people that want to justify all kinds of kind of gross, selfish behavior nowadays say, well, if that's what makes you feel good, if you like that, then that's okay for you. But if this philosophy were really true, we would be led to all kinds of possible conclusions, like the one I just pointed out. And so it seems to me we would have, this gets back to psychology, and ultimately by the time, I have to mention Krishna before we leave, or I'll definitely not be invited back here, but as a speaker. But the point is that if psychology aims to make people psychologically healthy, and generally psychological health is associated with a reasonable amount of happiness, self-satisfaction, and so on, then if we cannot reasonably conclude that whoever says, I'm happy doing whatever, that in every case they're referring to the same emotion, it can't be. Someone whom it makes happy, if it makes someone happy to murder innocent people, and it makes someone else happy to help innocent people, they cannot be referring to the same emotion when they use the same word. That's the linguistic problem. Or the cultural problem. Because they're both going to use the same word. And if we accept the modern idea that happiness is subjective, then we have to agree that there is no sense in which real happiness comes from helping people, or that murdering innocent people is not real happiness. Because the very adjective real is meaningless within a relativistic framework. If we're talking about a totally relativistic universe, you can't use words like real. And so, this is one of the problems, of course, in modern hedonistic, relativistic, incredibly unself-aware society. So, but then what happens to psychology? Is psychology just like almost like, let's say someone's taking a drug, like it has no meaning, it just makes you feel good. Imagine some drug that makes you no more intelligent than you were before you took it. It's not like some drug that someone claims opens certain windows into reality, or shows them certain things, like people used to claim about LSD. I don't know if they still claim that nowadays, but imagine a drug that does absolutely nothing to make you more intelligent, maybe make you more stupid, but it makes you feel good, like in Brave New World by Huxley. I mean, so if happiness is really subjective, why not just sort of complete a process which is well underway in this country and just medicate everybody? Give everyone the drug of their choice, create the Brave New World, leave people just sober enough to, you know, handle high-tech weapons that keep other people from coming and stopping us from using most of the world's resources. I mean, why not just medicate people? Why not just drug them? Is there any sense in which a state of happiness which you have, so to speak, earned, or which comes from virtue and real knowledge, is superior to a state of happiness which comes from popping a pill? And this of course gets to another point. I'm throwing all this stuff out on the table, and then I hope I'll clean up my mess before the lecture's over. But I guess I just didn't want to give like the stock, you know, off-the-shelf Hare Krishna lecture on psychology, because it would be very intellectually boring to me. I wanted to think about this. So anyway, so it gets into all these issues of what is real, and can we talk about objective states of consciousness or morality. I wanted to say this. I guess around the turn of the century, which still refers to the 19th century into the 20th century. I don't know when what happened 4 years ago will ever be called the turn of the century. But anyway, there was approximately 100 years ago and earlier, but kind of heated up, an explicit, conscious, philosophical attack among academic philosophers on metaphysics, on the idea that anything is real except the physical, basically. There was even an attempt, I mean, probably something should get an award for one of the worst philosophies, that behavioral psychology. I mean, obviously, you can learn about states of the mind through watching people's behavior. That's obviously true. If someone comes in here and is screaming and their veins are popping out of their neck, and the person's not a professional actor performing, it's very likely they're actually mad about something. So, I mean, you can learn something from watching people's behavior, but behaviorism, which was part of that attack on metaphysics, was the idea that no, anything you can know about someone, you know from their behavior. You can't talk meaningfully about internal states. There's a joke about behavioral psychologists. The two behavioral psychologists met, you know that one? And one of them said, "You're fine, how am I?" Anyway. So, I'm getting into all this because when you talk about psychology, in a sense, the big philosophical issue is, can you objectively talk about objectively talk about higher and lower states of consciousness, healthy and unhealthy states of consciousness? Is it just personal preference? And is there a morality to psychology? In other words, can we really talk about, in the ultimate sense, people being in immoral states of consciousness? Let's say someone who is dedicated to raping and killing. People would say, yes, but what about more subtle states? I mean, in other words, how gross does immorality have to be so that we're ready to call it immoral? In other words, is it only the most gross, the despicable acts that are truly immoral, whereas acts which are not so gross, it's just whatever people want to do? Like if you want to sing a rap song advising people to beat up women and kill policemen, that's okay, because that's just the way you feel about it. So, and then of course it gets to another philosophical question. If we can call any act immoral and do so objectively, if we can call any act immoral and do so objectively, on what basis do we do that? Because the theme song of this country is, don't impose your values on me. That's the theme song of this country. And so how can we impose our values, let's say, on a rapist? Then we say, well, you can do whatever you want as long as you don't interfere with the rights of others. Another slogan of this country, which shows that someone is not a deep thinker. Now, but how do you justify that? If I say I can do whatever I want, even if, and perhaps especially if, I'm imposing my values on others, especially if I'm harming someone else. In fact, it's no fun if there's no, if there's no blood in the water. And so I can say that harming someone else is the essence of what I mean by having a good time. And so if you say you can do whatever you want as long as you don't harm someone else, I say that's just your opinion, which you shouldn't impose on me. Or what if, for example, I'm here I am, some nice guy, and I opened up a quaint little shop somewhere, and I'm giving good service to my customers, and, really treating them right, and then what do you know? A mile away, they open a Walmart, and I'm out of business. I was harmed. I was significantly harmed. Now, some cultures say that that should be illegal. Like, say, highly socialistic countries may say, no, you can't open up the Walmart and drive these people out of business. In America, we think, balderdash. It's an archaic word I started throwing in. Keep you awake. Anyway, we think nonsense. We think nonsense that, that's free enterprise. If you don't believe me, ask the president. So, the point is, so even if you take something which everyone will vote for, yeah, you can do whatever you want as long as you don't harm someone. What if you harm what if you open up a Walmart, drive someone out of business, and their house is repossessed? Maybe the guy commits suicide. His wife is driven into mental depression, and her life is ruined. The children end up as juvenile delinquents because the father killed himself and the mother is depressed. Is that enough to be harm? I mean, does that count as harm? Driving someone to suicide, ruining the life of the wife who becomes depressed, the children become social misfits. I mean, does that count as harm? So you could say, well, but if but that harm is outweighed by a greater good, namely the right of greedy people to make a lot of money. And so, anyway, I don't want to get into all that, but so what is harm? Who gets to define harm? Even if you accept by itself a totally vacuous, a totally empty, pseudo-moral maxim, like you can do whatever you like as long as you don't harm others, but who gets to decide what harm is? I mean, the capitalists have one version, the socialists have another version. Who gets to define what counts as harm? And obviously every society agrees you can harm someone if you do it according to certain rules. So when you want to fill these things in, you just push the problem back one more step. It's just an infinite regress of problems. Namely, the problem still remains. Can we objectively speak about morality? And saying meaningless things like you can do what you like as long as you don't harm others is useless, number one, because how do we know that's objectively true? On what basis is that objectively true? And number two, even if you show it is objectively true, who gets to define harm? And who gets to define what the overriding good is that justifies a harm? You can see why philosophers are often eccentric. Anyway, so the point here is that, and then it gets back to psychology. Who gets to define what mental health is? In the former Soviet Union, if you joined the Hare Krishna movement, it was clear to the mental health community, the professional mental health community, that you were deranged and needed to be drugged and perhaps tortured and whatever. And of course, not only Hare Krishna, I don't want to say it's only us. It was if you became a Baptist, for that matter, if you became a Mormon, or I don't know, join some yoga group. So, okay, how much time do I have left? At the very end, I'll say Krishna. So, okay, now I'll get to after that brief preface, I'll get into my 3-hour sermon. Just kidding. Don't panic. It's just a joke. So, what I wanted to say is that ultimately in Krishna consciousness, how many of you know kind of what we're doing? How many people here have no idea what we're doing, what Vedic culture is? Okay, we'll save time. So Vedic culture I mean, as a theistic system, ultimately. And by Vedic culture, of course, Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, 15:15. I'll just write it for you. Krishna says, Vedaischa sarvaira hameva Vedi, which literally means all and, because he's been talking about other things. Vedais, by the Vedas, by all of them. Vedaischa sarvaira, by all the Vedas, aham eva, I alone. I'll show you one little trick. I can't help it, then I'll go back to this. A Sanskrit H tends to become a European G. I happen to have a little hobby linguistics. So, for example, you get the very well-known Sanskrit word, which you still have in India today, Vahan, which means a vehicle. And, of course, you just change the H to a G, and you get the German word Wagen, which they write, the W is pronounced V, like Volkswagen. And similarly, you take the Sanskrit word aham, and you get the Greek word ego. Anyway, so here, Vedaisha, by all the Vedas, I alone am to be known. Vedya is a particular grammatical form in Sanskrit which we can't do in English with one word, which means I think it's called something like the future subjunctive or something. To be known. Vedya, to be known. So what Krishna is saying is that, well, I just told you what he's saying. Now, if you think about what Vedic culture is, Vedic culture has to be, this is a no-brainer, the culture which is based on the Vedas. Now, if Krishna makes this very radical statement, the Bhagavad Gita, which we're kind of used to because it's been around a long time, in its time was a very radical, revolutionary book. Because if you read Mahabharata, you can see what was going on back then in the name of Vedic culture. Because, I mean, read Mahabharata as a cultural anthropologist or as a philologist, and you can see what was going on back then, what the culture was. Now, it appears to be Vedic culture all over the place. Like there's, yajna, and there's brahmanas and sacrifices and mantras and tantras and yantras. It's like this Vedic culture all over the place. But in the middle of all that, Krishna says in chapter 4, the actual yoga, the actual spiritual science is lost. So Krishna makes this very radical claim in the Bhagavad Gita. In its time, it was very revolutionary. It still is. That in the midst of all this apparently Vedic culture, Krishna says the real thing is lost. Yoga nashta parantapa. And then he makes the equally radical assertion that I alone am to be known by all the Vedas. Which means real Vedic culture must be the culture which is focused on Krishna. If you take the Bhagavad Gita seriously. If you don't have to worry about this. But if you do take the Bhagavad Gita seriously, even if you take the history of religion seriously, then you have to deal with this. So our use of the word Vedic is coming from Krishna, actually. Now, in the Vedic culture, I just wanted to get that in the Vedic culture, there is definitely the claim that there is an objective reality, and that reality, objective reality, is both quantitative and qualitative. Because of the philosophical attack on metaphysics, things like, for example, justice. Justice is metaphysical. There's no physical thing you can put on the table which is a justice, or here's three justices. Here's a blue justice, a green justice, here's a rather heavy justice, here's a justice with a rough surface. Justice is metaphysical. For that matter, yesterday is. Because you can't empirically prove yesterday. That doesn't exist now. But anyway, it's another philosophical discussion. You can show yesterday's newspaper, but someone might have printed it today. So, but take justice, or morality, and so on and so forth. These are all metaphysical principles. So with the Western philosophical attack on metaphysics, and there have been Indian philosophical attacks on metaphysics, what you're left with is a completely quantitative notion of objectivity. In other words, if you want to be objective about something, quantify it. Like you can objectively say, this is 1 cup, these are 2 tables, there are 4 people. So the whole notion of objectivity becomes quantitative. And there's been a systematic attack. To say that there's been an attack on metaphysics is to say there's been an attack on qualitative objectivity. The notion there is an objective thing called justice. It's not that we see in different cultures they have different systems of justice, and it's all relative, but still we can objectively say this is just, that is unjust. Or we can objectively say this is beautiful, that's ugly. And say it objectively. Because beauty is metaphysical. I mean, you can point to an object, and I can say, for example, this is a real, I guess, ozone-busting styrofoam cup. Now, if someone says, that's a beautiful cup, maybe they like the form of it. I mean, they try to design these things with a little aesthetic sense. So, now, if you say the beauty, let's say, just imagine this is a beautiful cup. Just go with that for now. Forget the fact that it's styrofoam. So this is a beautiful cup. Now if we say, where's the beauty in the cup? If I say, where is the cup, you can locate it mathematically in a particular point on the earth. And we can talk about it in many quantitative ways, but if I say, where's the beauty? If you say a beautiful person, say someone's physically beautiful, where is the beauty? Again, there could be an attempt to reduce beauty to numbers. Say, well, it's proportion, which can be measured quantitatively. Like if you have a face that has a certain proportion, the eyes are a certain distance apart, the size of the eyes stands in a certain proportion, mathematical proportion to the size of the nose, the size of the mouth, and so on. You can see it gets very funny. So, where's the beauty? And yet ultimately, if there's a personal God, if there's a personal God, then it without going through all the steps, you sort of come to the conclusion there's such a thing as qualitative objectivity. You can because if there wasn't, you couldn't say God is the most beautiful. You couldn't say Krishna is most beautiful. You couldn't really glorify God. All you could say is he's the most numerous, or he's like he has the highest numbers or something. And what would that mean? But even to glorify God and say God is most beautiful, God is most kind, the typical ways that people glorify God, and historically, how could you say that? How could that be objectively true? That God is most kind, God is most beautiful, God is wisest. Imagine everything that entailed by the notion of ultimate wisdom. So to have a God who's anything but the ultimate number system, I mean, to have a God that you can actually praise in the normal ways throughout the world that people have praised God, you're faced with the reality or the claim of qualitative objectivity. And if there is such a thing as qualitative objectivity, it seems that it could be applied to this world also. Because the more that things are godlike, the more they could be described metaphysically, qualitatively as being just, beautiful, especially talking about character, having beautiful character, or a beautiful mind, or being fair, just, being kind. The more people were godlike, the more you could attribute objectively these qualities to them. And then, of course, it gets back to consciousness. Psychology. In the sense that the more one is God conscious, the more one would be in a healthy state of consciousness. Now, if someone claims to be in divine consciousness and they do all kinds of crazy things, like blowing up innocent people in terrorist acts, or some of these groups commit mass suicide. In other words, again, like happiness, not everyone that claims they're acting in God consciousness would really make the cut. And I won't go through the whole philosophical thing there because you don't deserve it right now. But in the sense that it'd be a punishment to go through all that again. But still, it is not a historical coincidence that at the same time that there is this attack on the notion of God, especially a personal God, there is a general attack on metaphysics. And so, I guess I'm making the general philosophical point, which I think, actually I find intellectually interesting. I haven't thought of it before, but the general philosophical point that there is a crucial, there's an essential link, logically, there's a logical, almost you could say, I think you could almost say a necessary logical connection between the validity of metaphysics and the validity of God. And even the validity of the personal God. And by validity here, I mean the objective validity, or the valid objectivity. In other words, it seems to me that if you care about things like being reasonable, if someone feels no discomfort in self-contradiction, of course, this won't apply to them. I mean, in other words, if it doesn't bother you at all to contradict yourself, don't worry about this. But if you place any positive value on being a coherent, reasonable person and making sense, then I think you can see that there's a real sense in which God, and even some type of personal God, and metaphysics go hand in hand. They kind of sink or rise together. And going back to psychology without metaphysics can be nothing but a type of drug, which is kind of devolving into anyway. But I mean, psychology can be nothing but a way to make people feel better, and you could not meaningfully say that someone is actually in a better state of mind. Because that's metaphysical. I mean, physically, you can only say things are like this cup is white, this table is standing on, well, two T-shaped legs. You can only talk about physical states, and to say one is better. I mean, like for example, let's say we're only talking about physical, even chemical descriptions here. If I say this cup is better than that table, it's like, what? Now, I could say this cup more, let's say, contains water better than the table, because I pour the water on the table. Watch out. If I pour the water on the table will not effectively contain the water. It will, I could say, the table more effectively disperses the water than the cup over a wide surface. But then again, to say better has no moral sense to it. If you look up the word better in the dictionary, the word better can be a word used in a moral context. Let's say Mary loves people, John hates people and tries to harm them, so Mary is a better person than John. That's the moral sense of better. But if I say this is a better styrofoam cup that we've invented here, we're about to put on the market, it's not moral. It's just in relation to someone's purpose. Like, I want to contain water, so this cup is good for containing water. It's not morally good. What would it mean to say this cup is morally good? If you said, well, there's someone dying of thirst there, and so I use this cup to bring them water, but then the moral goodness lies in my act, not in the cup itself. Because what I mean to say is that even for psychology to be able to say things like, this is a normal state of mind, this is within the range of normalcy, because we talk a little about ranges, this is within the range of normalcy, this is not healthy, this is a better state of consciousness than that. If you mean these things in anything other than the most crass, cold, utilitarian, functional sense, if there's any moral sense whatsoever to saying, for example, that this person was antisocial and hated people and was violent, now this person loves people, if in any sense you want to say, if you want to use any moral sense to say this is a better state of mind, then you're in the metaphysical realm again. Again, you are in a metaphysical realm. And if someone says, well, no, all I mean by that, in a non-moral sense, is that society has an interest in having people not attack it. Well, why? Are we only talking about people's sensations, that the individual society don't want the sensation of having a knife stuck in them or having their property robbed? In other words, does everything reduce down to sensations? If there's anything but of course in that sense, Hitler wasn't a bad person and in any moral sense, and no one is a good person in any moral sense. What it comes down to at the end of the day, despite the fact people may get kind of risque in their philosophical claims, at the end of the day, people do believe some things are right and wrong. And to believe that some things are right and wrong is to accept the validity of metaphysics. And to accept the validity of metaphysics, I think logically will ultimately require you to accept a personal God. And the conclusion of all this would be that to be truly rational, one has to understand that there's a personal God. Anyway, I'm satisfied with that conclusion, so that's one I wanted to make. Any questions on that? Who's Krishna, of course. Any questions on these points? Yes.
When you use the word Krishna, are you denying all other names for God?
No, not at all. God has innumerable names. In fact, anyone that's calling or trying to call upon God, whatever noise comes out of them in a sense of the name of God, if you think about it, if a child cries out for the mother or father, I mean, whatever sound they make, the mother or father understands the child is calling me. And a name is that by which you're called, isn't it? It's like, they call me Jed, or something. So if you think about it, that by which you're called is your name. It may not be your legal name or your Christian name, as they say in this country. It may not be in your birth certificate, but it functions. It functions as your name at that moment. Like if someone looks you straight in the eye and says, "Hey, Bobby." I mean, you know that they're calling you. You say, "My name's not Bobby, but..." "Right, Bobby." There's this hilarious, anyway, potato chip commercial I can tell you about. I won't go into it now. When I was a kid. They sort of played on that. But, so we have our official name. We have our official name. But then again, a name is kind of what someone calls something. As Shakespeare said, a rose is a rose is a rose, and what would smell as sweet with any other name. So in that sense, you could say that if you are calling God, and that's really what you're doing, you're trying to call on God, or then whatever you say is in a sense the name of God. And as far as how much information or how much conceptual power you bring to your understanding of God, of course, varies with different people. And so we can definitely talk with people knowing more or less about God. Someone thinks that, well, God, all they know about God is that God makes the grass grow, and that's the limit. I mean, that's true, but God does other things besides making grass grow. So yes, many people all around the world, most people I would say, are calling upon God in some way or other. And I'm sure God accepts any sincere prayer coming from anyone, whatever their particular religion or conception. That does not mean to say that God is totally relative. I mean, God obviously is something. He's not just, God is not simply an absolutely variable conception in the minds of many people. And so we can ultimately advance. For example, it seems perfectly reasonable to conclude that God is infinitely beautiful. And so the question is, well, who is that infinitely beautiful God? Now, St. Anselm, or Anselm, I guess by saying St. Anselm, I'm kind of being a little Catholic there, but anyway, the philosopher Anselm, I think it was Anselm, came up with the famous ontological proof of the existence of God, which actually you could use to prove that Krishna is God. Do you know? Se acabó la... Do you know what his ontological argument is for the existence of God? Sort of famous in philosophy circles. It's kind of argument that it seems like that can't be right, but to this day, like 1,000 years later, atheistic philosophers are still struggling to refute it. But anyway, what Anselm said is that God is that being than whom there can be no greater being. He thought that the corollary of this, or what's entailed by this, if you say that God doesn't exist, then I can imagine a greater being, namely a God that does exist. of course, he assumes that existence is a plus. But I think you could argue for that, because if existence is not a plus, then there are no pluses. I mean, anyway, I won't go into that. I don't want to give you all a headache. But for the moment, assume that Anselm was right. For example, a cup of water that exists, you could say, is better than a cup of water that doesn't exist, especially when you're thirsty. So Anselm says, God is that being than whom no greater being can exist. So if you say God doesn't exist, I can imagine a greater being, namely a God that does exist. And so therefore, if God is is a being than whom no greater being can exist, he must exist. This kind of argument kind of sounds like a trick, a philosophical trick. It's just hard to refute. Now, the point I wanted to make is this, that if Anselm is right, then it seems that great Christian philosophical argument would prove Krishna. Because I can imagine a greater being than the Christian God, Krishna. I don't mean to say that Christians aren't worshiping God. That's not my point. I'm sure they are worshiping God. I'm simply saying I think their conception is not the last word in theology. Because, for example, their conception of God. For example, if you believe in eternal damnation. Now, obviously, if you read the newspapers that, let's say, some father, maybe living out somewhere in rural Georgia, got very unhappy with his, let's say, his 9 sons, because 9 children, because they disobeyed him, and so he tied them up, poured lighter fluid on them, and burned them alive. I mean, clearly that person would be seen by everyone, almost everyone, as an evil monster, as like something outside the human race. And yet that is attributed to God. Like, God is worse. He's got this special lighter fluid where you never burn up completely. So now, I mean, consider. Never mind religion, never mind faith. Just imagine, philosophically, if it were the case that there is someone who punishes people that disobey him by torturing them for billions of years, simply because people who may actually, in a mundane sense, be kind of nice people, or pay their taxes and stop at red lights and give the Red Cross, but didn't specifically obey him, that he will torture them in the most horrible ways possible for billions and trillions and quadrillions of years, for, let's say, a few years of disobedience. I mean, clearly, never mind religion. If you heard there was such a being, I think you would almost be led to believe that that is a being than whom no more evil being can exist. It would be a total inversion of the ontological argument. Or a God, let's say, or if you heard there was someone who, let's say you go home tonight, there's a knock at your door, some SWAT team breaks down or kicks down your door. They don't knock, they kick down your door, they come in, they arrest you, throw you in jail, because it turns out that genealogists, perhaps working for the Mormon Church, whatever, anyway, the genealogists have now demonstrated that, 800 years ago, somewhere else in the world, in Asia or Europe or wherever, one of your relatives stole something. And you're now going to jail for it. Original sin. Or, I mean, imagine a God whom you can't see. I mean, clearly, in terms of human relationships, a person you can see is a big advantage over someone you can't see. Some people, we think, I never want to see you again, but the relationship is already kind of shot at that point. But imagine someone you like. And if you actually like someone, being able to see them is better than not being able to see them. And so, if you take Anselm's argument, God is that being than whom there can be no greater being, then you could say that's true. However, if we look at particular theological traditions around the world, it is possible to say that there is a greater being than the one conceived of within a particular historical theological tradition. Even if we accept, as we do, that these people are worshiping the true God, They are worshiping God, but worshiping God through a particular theological or philosophical lens, which is somewhat limited. And so if you take Anselm seriously, God is that being than whom no greater being can be conceived, then God must not only have the attribute of existence, and that's what Anselm was concerned with. It's called ontological proof, because ontology is concerned with existence. So Anselm was especially concerned with showing God exists. But we don't have to stop there. We can also demonstrate that God must, if God must exist, because that's a positive attribute, God must also be infinitely beautiful. Were he not infinitely beautiful, we could imagine a greater God, namely the one that is infinitely beautiful. And in this way, ultimately, you'll come to Krishna. You follow? Yes. For a price. Okay, the modes of nature. Yeah, actually, I looked that up. In Sanskrit, the word for modes of nature, a four-syllable translation, is actually the word guna. The word guna in Sanskrit, the first meaning, the primary meaning in the dictionary, is a thread or strand. Sometimes we say it's a rope. It actually means like part of a rope or part of a thread. In other words, when you weave things together to make a rope or thread, one strand of that is a guna. And because the material world is conceived of as sort of like a tapestry of qualities, like people are composed of different qualities, so it also in that sense means equality. And in the sense of triguna, three, the set of three gunas, it refers to passion, goodness, and ignorance. Out of order. Ignorance, passion, goodness. Bottom up. So I was actually going to talk about that. I mean, I won't too much talk about it now, but if you talk about psychology or states of consciousness, ultimately the way to get at psychology objectively is to talk about these three qualities, because we can talk about ignorant, passionate, and virtuous states of consciousness based on these three qualities. So there's a direct link between these three modes and psychology. Yes.
Could we make the claim, or you kind of make the claim, that if a person doesn't have faith or contact with a personal God, then he is insane?
Well, I was dealing more with philosophy. I was saying that people in the real world, people actually do accept that there are objective metaphysical realities. Like there really is such a thing as justice and injustice. There really is such a thing as beauty and unbeauty, whatever you want to call it. There really is such a thing as right and wrong. It really is wrong to murder innocent people, and it really is right not to do that and to help people. And so people, for all their bluster, for all their relativistic bluster, that, don't impose your opinions on other people, which they just use to justify their piggish lifestyle. Despite all that bluster, if you push them far enough, like everybody else, the cows will all come home. Like everybody else, if they're pushed far enough, they will end up arguing that, well, some things really are right and some things really are wrong. Which means that almost everybody accepts there is such a thing as objective metaphysics, like right and wrong. And if that's true, and if you're asked, well, what is the basis of saying that some things are objectively right and wrong, how do you philosophically justify that? You're going to be led, I think, inevitably back to a personal God. Otherwise, just go ahead and try to objectively, philosophically justify right and wrong without a personal God. See how far you get. Logically, see how far you get. And so I don't want to say it's insane, but at least incoherent. Yes.
I just heard about this. I don't have a very deep knowledge about it. But it seems that the Arab world was a very low value at a point of time. I mean, Islam was founded. It was really important for them to have a good religion.
A good
religion. So Muhammad, the Prophet, he founded Islam. But then the way he propagated Islam was with a sword in his hand. What we call as jihad, the war from his religion. Now, how do we justify this with all the talks that we did today?
With
With the talks that we did today, with the talks we had today.
Well, Islamic history is, perhaps I won't go into the history of Muhammad and Islamic history, which requires some knowledge of history and the social conditions of the time and so on. But I think what's more obvious is some contemporary interpretations of Muhammad and jihad and so on. And I think that I think it should be obvious to any reasonable person that some of those interpretations are evil and wrong. And I think good Muslims know that. So that most Muslims know that. So that, for example, there are theology professors of theology at certain Middle Eastern universities that publish articles and books giving sort of these quote-unquote learned justifications of murdering innocent people. This, I think, is comparable to what happened in Europe. For example, at the same time that Newton was publishing his works in the late 17th century, and before this Newtonian revolution really kind of rationalized a bit more Western civilization, but still at the time of Newton, there were university professors in Europe, at the best universities, publishing learned essays on how you could scientifically tell what woman was really a witch and which one wasn't, so you know you were burning the right one. And so, to me, these quote-unquote learned academic explanations of how to identify witches so you can burn the right women, I think there's something similar to that and these quote-unquote learned theological justifications of blowing up innocent people. I mean, clearly there's a clear family resemblance here. So, of course, I mean, it's not that Islam is the only religion in which certain evil is being propagated, but clearly I think at this point in history they are in first place. Not Islam, I don't want to say Islam, but I want to say a certain wing of it, a certain type of fundamentalist Islam, which is not the majority, obviously, of Muslims, thank God. But there is definitely a certain segment of them who are evil in the name of God. So it should be clear to us that some people are perform evil acts in the name of God. And that's why God, who is the ultimate justification of moral objectivity, cannot himself be, how should I, used to justify moral relativism. In other words, there's something actually sort of ridiculous, I mean, philosophically absurd, about someone saying, well, if that's their religion, if they believe that's right. In other words, the attempt to relativize religious claims is philosophically almost absurd because it's ultimately God which philosophically is the basis for moral objectivity. You follow the point?
I was actually looking for an explanation how we can justify his acts. Well, I don't think that is wrong. Maybe this society, this
Muhammad. You don't know Muhammad? Well, that's a historical issue. I think people could argue that Muhammad was not simply a just violent person, was not obsessed with violence. He took certain steps during his time because they were sort of necessary or appropriate at the time. And so therefore, that's why I didn't comment on Muhammad, because I think that's a much more complex issue. Whereas I think people that blow up buses and airplanes and hotels are, I think that is not a complex moral issue. Yes.
What is the opposite to the real world that you just said? What is the opposite to the real objective world? Which paradigm you take to...
Oh, relativism. Everything is relative. For example, saying that there is no such thing as justice or injustice. It's just relative to a particular civilization. So that, let's say, if in certain countries or certain communities it's okay to, your grandfather gets old, to sort of perform some type of tribal euthanasia and then roast him and eat him, you can't say that's wrong. That's just because it's right for that society, because they think it's right. So justice and injustice, right and wrong, are relative to a particular community. And if you want to say, well, never mind what these people or those people think, what really is fair and unfair? Well, you can't say that. There is no such thing. In fact, it was stated by Protagoras, who spoke to Socrates, who said, man is the... Well, he meant people. I'll just say man, that's what I was trying to say. That's probably what he said. You know, it was a male chauvinist society anyway in Greece. So, man is the measure of all things. Man is the measure of all things. Of things that are, that they are, of things that are not, that they are not. To say that anything is or isn't whatever, to say this is whatever, or this is not whatever, Protagoras said that man is the measure of all that. It's whatever people decide. There is no objective truth outside human opinions. So that's relativism. And to some extent, people have to be forced to be virtuous, because therefore, it's for that reason that we have police and laws and jails and punishment. Otherwise, someone could, let's say, drive at 130 miles an hour in a crowded school zone. And people have to be forced not to do that. Or forced not to steal or rape or murder and so on. But then, I mean, obviously you can follow all the laws of this country and still be a pretty immoral person, as we know.
So what is the true of an opinion?
Oh, okay, let me just finish that.
Okay.
I'm going to get back to this. Un momentito. So if you say, apart from just being a good citizen, which in this country can still allows you to murder innocent creatures and be sexually promiscuous and so on and so forth. So if you say, not in a legal sense, but in a more enlightened spiritual sense, I want to be a virtuous person, then you may be a person of incredible self-discipline that can just force themselves. But it's much more practical. People really have to become purified. You have to, it's like physically, if you want to be able to walk and run and move your body normally, you need to be healthy. If your body's not healthy, it's hard to move it normally. And so if you want to be able to move virtuously in the world, you have to be a healthy soul. And of course, we do that by Bhakti Yoga. And the most important aspect of Bhakti Yoga, and this is chanting Hare Krishna, chanting Krishna's names. So it's by Atma Shodhanam, self-purification and so on, that we act, because virtue is our nature. We are by nature virtuous. So to be a good person, you simply need to literally uncover yourself. And you said?
What is the true of an opinion of somebody? I mean, you just say that, I asked you before, what is the opposite of the real world? I mean, what is the opposite to the objective world?
Yeah.
You say that...
Relativism.
Relativism.
Like, for example, if I say, I am now on the Georgia Tech campus, and someone says, that's just your opinion. It is my opinion, but it's not just my opinion. It may also be a fact that I'm aware of. And so that ubiquitous phrase you always hear, just your opinion. To say to someone that it's just an opinion means that it's not objectively true outside your belief that it's true. But of course, for someone to say that, they would have to know an objective truth. That's one of the typical, amazingly hypocritical contradictions that have become so prevalent in our society. For example, if let's say I say Krishna is God, and an agnostic, let's say an agnostic, this makes the point, says to me, that's just your opinion. It is actually philosophically impossible for an agnostic. It is logically impossible for an agnostic to say to me that that's just your opinion. It's logically impossible for him to say that. It's legally possible. It's physiologically possible. It's not philosophically possible. Because, let's say, for example, you're taking a test in chemistry. Now, let's say, for example, you write out a chemical equation. And the professor marks the answer wrong and says, that was just your opinion. Meaning it's not can't show it's right. It's just your opinion. Now, in order for the professor to say that it's just your opinion, the professor has to know the right answer. How can you say to someone your answer is wrong or that's just your opinion unless you know the right answer? Now, if I say Krishna is God and someone says an agnostic cannot say that's just your opinion, because to be an agnostic, which in Sanskrit, agyani, gnosis in Greek is just jnana in Sanskrit. So agnostic is just agyani, someone that doesn't know. To be an agnostic means you don't know if there's a God or so what God is. So if you don't know the answer, how can you mark another answer wrong? Duh. I mean, if they, let's say I come to Georgia Tech and they give me a chemistry exam to grade or to correct. Good luck. You're going to get a very wild thing back because I literally slept through 90% of my high school chemistry class and got a D in it only because I was already admitted into the University of California and I was flunking out of high school, so they made a deal. But anyway, I cut a deal and got all D's, and I was allowed to go to the university. So, but the point is, obviously, I could not mark an answer on a chemistry test right or wrong because I don't know the right answer. So I would have to. I'm an agnostic when it comes to chemistry. I mean, I know it exists, but I don't know if a particular claim in the realm of chemistry is true or not. I cannot tell you. So therefore, how could I answer? So if a chemist comes up to me and says, hey, this is a particular chemical equation, if I say, that's just your opinion, how in God's name could I say to a chemist, that's just your opinion, if I don't know chemistry? It's absurd. And therefore, for an agnostic, by being agnostic, forfeits any philosophical right to say that any claim about God is right or wrong. Follow? But that doesn't stop people. Yes.
I just wanted to ask, how do you determine
How do you determine? Well,
chemistry is like a little level.
okay, but take chemistry for example. Let's say if the professor says, if you mix this and this, you're going to get water, and you mix this and that, and it blows up, and then what you have in your, all over the place is this horrible green liquid that's, dissolving everything in its path. I mean, clearly that's not water. So in the same way, if someone makes a claim that if you do this, you'll get to know God, you have to see whether you actually come to divine consciousness. You have to see whether other people that follow that path are really becoming God conscious. Because if someone really is in higher God consciousness, there's a certain energy about it. And it produces a certain kind of behavior and a certain wisdom. And so it is like chemistry in that sense. You have to get in there and get into the lab and see what happens. If someone says, I'm God conscious, that's why I just blew up the school bus, it's like, no. So ultimately, the great thing about being alive and conscious and having a human body is that it's so existentially, there's so many opportunities. There's so many existential opportunities. You can go out there and investigate reality and look for God. Yes.
Going back to the agnostic thing, if the agnostic person says, if I'm an agnostic person, I say, you think there's God, that's just your opinion. I don't necessarily have to know if there's no God or that there is a God in order to say your opinion is wrong. I could be saying, I'm agnostic, I don't know. What I mean by this is that not only do I not know if there's a God, nobody knows.
But you see, those two claims, I don't know and nobody knows, have no logical connection. In fact, they're logically disconnected. If I say, I don't know chemistry, and no one knows chemistry, wait a second, if I don't know chemistry, how do I know someone else doesn't know it? Because if someone else did know it, I wouldn't know anyway. In other words, let's say, for example, you get two people come into this room. There's one same thing. Say two people come into the room. One of them is a really good chemist. The other one is a really good bluffer. A really good bluffer. But, knows nothing about chemistry to bluff his head off. I cannot tell you which one is the real chemist. Let's say you get two people bluffing. In other words, if you don't know a particular field, how can you say someone else doesn't know? To say, I don't know, no one knows, just shows that someone is just sort of a nasty person. If I don't know, no one can know. It's just kind of like an infantile sour grapes thing. It's not a logical argument. Yes. Oh, you want to...
So could an agnostic say to somebody, it's my opinion that is just your opinion without any logical contradiction?
They could say, but they would have to say it is just my opinion.
It's just my opinion, it's just your opinion.
Or they couldn't even say that. Agnosticism is really tough because they could say, I believe that you don't know. But they couldn't say, but they could not unconditionally assert that is just your opinion. They could say, I believe that it's just your opinion, which would have more to do with their epistemology, their theory of knowledge. They could say, I believe that even if there were a God, you couldn't know God, or that whatever, which is a theory of knowledge. But they could never say, it's just your opinion. They could only say, that's my belief. But I don't ultimately know if that's just your opinion or not. Yes?
In your argument with chemistry is like a defined science.
Yes.
I think with theology, there's many different chemistry books.
Right.
For every religion. So.
But if you look at the history of science, you can find a period, certainly in European history, and probably all over the world, where chemistry was somewhat mystical. And there were many kinds of books. And then finally it became basically, you could say, rationalized or objectified and so on. But there is a period in which it was kind of mystical and subjective and silly sometimes. So for me to say that there's a science of God analogous to chemistry, in order for me to say that, I would have to also claim, it's good, you're bringing out some of the premises, the unstated premises. I would have to also claim that there is indeed an objective reality which is God. So that's ontological, talking about what objectively exists. And then epistemologically, because I just said that, I obviously believe that there are ways in which you can know that to be true. You can know that it's true, and you can know how it's true and what the truth of it is. And so I'll start off here. If it's the case, if it is the case, you can see that I've been ruined by philosophy classes. If it is the case that there is an objective reality which is God, and if it's also the case that we can, in a systematic, coherent way, know that reality, then we have all that we need to construct a science. All you need for a science is to have an objective reality and a valid way of knowing it. And if you have those two things, a valid, coherent way of knowing it, if you have those two things, you can construct a science. The fact that the current view of that field, or the current approach to that field, seems to consist of incoherent, contradictory claims, does not in and of itself prove that there could not be a science. And again, the proof of that is that virtually in every field which has now been rendered into a science, whether it's geology or astronomy, especially astronomy, or even chemistry, you can show a period in history or a place in the world today. I mean, in America, you can go somewhere in America and still find communities where that same area of reality is dealt with in a non-rational or irrational, unscientific way by people who feel they're being objective about it. And so the current state of belief about God and religion does not tell us about the potential of constructing a science in that field, necessarily. In fact, one of the problems we have is that modern science as we know it, roughly speaking, to some extent grew up in opposition to European religion. Probably the most famous case is Galileo. And in fact, even in let's say, in the late 18th century in Western Europe, say in France, France is the most famous case of this, you had all these salons, people like Voltaire and Rousseau, and in England they had certain thinkers, Burke and others. Anyway, the reason these people, these famous thinkers, in many cases the best philosophers of their time, the reason they were in these salons is because they couldn't get jobs in the universities. The reason they couldn't get jobs in the universities is because the universities, even after Newton, even after, decades after Newton, the universities, still tightly controlled by churches, were still teaching Aristotelian astronomy. So what I mean to say is that there is, let's say, philosophy per se or science per se, and then there is what is called the sociology of knowledge. In other words, we can study that at different historical periods, there are different assumptions in a society and a culture which tend to filter knowledge, that certain things are considered valid, certain things are considered invalid. And there may be a particular field which at the present time is sort of in an unscientific state, for the most part. But that doesn't, in and of itself, prove that there could not be, or should not be, or that in fact there isn't already somewhere in the world a science in that field. So that's what I would say.